Hello, we're going to talk about the Civil War today. And when I talk about the Civil War, I got to title my paper. If I don't title my paper, I don't know what I'm talking about, right? And in case you don't know the Civil War, this is a war between brother and brother. This is a war between cousins and cousins. This is between the North and the South, slavery versus no slavery. It's a huge dynamic piece of American history. And it lasted between the years of 1861 to 1865. And hundreds of thousands of people died in this war. And we're going to specifically talk about the North versus the South. Now, as I talk about these two sides, you got to understand they didn't just call themselves the North and the South. One side referred to themselves as the Union, and the other side called themselves a Confederacy. Now, a Confederacy, and I know that's not a word that we use often, neither is a Union anymore. When we talk about a Confederacy, though, we're actually talking about a loose collection of states. And you probably don't remember, but if you do remember, this is kind of what we had with the Articles of Confederation, the first government we had in our country that didn't work. So they decided to get rid of it and form a constitutional convention and make a new constitution, and that's the government we have right now. And the biggest problem they had was it created a really, really weak government, weak central government. Well, somehow the people in the South thought that this was going to be a better idea than what they had now. And a lot of it's because they were afraid of losing the institutions and the economics that they had in the South at the time, which really depended on slavery. So things were changing not just in our country, but worldwide. And those changes created a lot of fear in the South. And they started thinking, well, we just need to do our own thing. And so what you've got is this idea that they could form their own country. Now, you notice I drew that in a little cloud because whenever you think of South and whenever you think of the Confederacy, I want you to think of a loose collection of states and this weak central government, okay? And I use yellow because yellow is what I use to highlight an important idea or important concept. And when I say important concepts, well, we got important concepts for the North too, because you don't know what a union is. A union is a strong central government. And yeah, it's usually a tight collection of states, but I'm not going to rate that because I don't have a lot of room. But also, you can kind of make that inference because if one is a loose collection of states, then maybe the other one's probably the exact opposite, which is really what it is. And remember, I'm drawing my arrow. I'm going to color that yellow because I use yellow to remind me of important concepts. And as we talk about the North and the South, also keep in mind that the North would be known as anti-slavery. And don't think that anti-slavery means all people in the North thought people in the South should be equal. When I say people in the South, I'm really talking about black people. That's not always the case. Sometimes, but in some cases they didn't. They didn't think they were equals, but they didn't think they should necessarily be enslaved. And in the South, obviously, we have a complete opposite point of view. Really, the Southern people or the Southern government, the Confederacy, would have been very much pro slavery. And like I said, a lot of their money, their income, their well being depended on maintaining this horrible institution of slavery. Now, I am a patriot. I do love my country. I served in the military for quite a number of years, but I'm not ignorant to know that sometimes we have dark points in our history, and we have to talk about the good with the bad. It can't always be about uh, um, gumdrops and sunny days. Sometimes you've got to talk about bad things that happen, and slavery is definitely one of those bad things, because better understanding of slavery and this time period that we go through helps us understand how our country's grown, evolved, and become the beacon of hope that it really is to so many people in the world. Not a perfect beacon, but definitely a beacon of hope to many people. So as we talk about our map down here, we're going to make some divisions here, because the North and the South, it was really drawn along an invisible line that would divide up our state. Now, this is not going to be a perfect uh, division of our country, mainly because these states are kind of wonky when you start looking at them, how they're all drawn. And we're going to draw an invisible line right here. And once again, that's not perfect, but over here was considered the West, except for California. California was settled, but they really weren't much of a player, because California was clear over here, everything's over here, and there's a lot of stuff going on between this point and this point. So they really weren't much of a factor. But we start looking at how our country's divided up. We're going to look at the United States in terms of a North and a South. And we're going to put this right here, because this is really an important thing to add in here. You guys know what this is? This is the Mississippi River. And that's really probably not exactly where it goes. It probably goes a little bit different direction, but I don't care. I don't have a perfect map to go off of. I'm going off memory, and we're not trying to be perfect anyway on this map. If we had the states there, we'd know, because we know Iowa's right there, right by the Mississippi. We know Missouri's down here. In fact, Missouri's got a really interesting history when it comes to the North and the South, the Confederacy, and all that good stuff. But we'll talk about that later. So we're going to use some colors to divide up the two sides. And the North, you better get associated with this right now, because if you don't, you are going to be lost as you start talking about the North and the South. We talk about the North, we always define that in terms of color, the blue. And I know for a map, we use blue for rivers and lakes and stuff like that. But, we're going to use blue to help us commemorate the North in this conflict, because the color, the blue and the gray, has big affiliation or big connections to this time period. And the North be called Blue Bellies and Yankees and stuff like that. The North be Johnny Reb and Graybeards, and they'd both have different names, but some of those names were connected to colors of uniforms. And when the war first started, color uniforms was a big issue. That was a big boo-boo, because the South didn't have an adopted color gray, and the North didn't have an adopted color gray. And sometimes they would have mix and match colors. There'd be guys going to combat. The first major battle was called the Battle of Bull Run, and there was one unit had all these guys had these bright red pants on. Well, I'm sorry, if you wear bright red pants to a conflict, makes a pretty easy target for people to shoot in the fog of war. So I wouldn't recommend doing that if you ever want to start your own army. It's not good practice. Bright colors. Say, look at me, look at me. And when you say, look at me in combat, that's when people say, shoot at him, shoot at him. Okay, so we got gray and we got blue. And I'm going to name my countries, because these are essentially, for 4 years, 2 different countries. You've got one country called the United States. And we know that because we live in the United States. And we've got something called the Confederate States, which is down south. And you notice how when I do these letters, I make them big? Kind of like a real map. The biggest things on the map are usually a little bigger wording. And if you want to abbreviate these, this would be the USA versus the CSA. And that's kind of substantial, especially when you're talking about ships and uniforms and whatever. Sometimes they'll see these abbreviations there, the USA or the CSA. It's on coins. It could be on their swords. It could be whatever. So that's our abbreviation, United States of America, Confederate States of America, two different sides, and they both had their own capitals. And crazy enough, they're only about 100 miles apart. For the North, we had something, the same thing we have now, actually. Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. isn't actually in a state. It was developed early on in our country's history, and it was defined in the U.S. Constitution. And it's a little chunk of land that's between the North and the South. Actually, it's in the South. I take that back, but between two different states. But just south of there was the Confederate capital. This is a place called Richmond, Virginia. And Richmond, Virginia is still part of the state of Virginia now, but for the purposes of this conflict, it was considered a it was considered the capital of